I'm absolutely delighted that this first session has with us the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Jeremy, I think that never has a Tory shadow ministerial team for culture worked harder or with more obviously genuine relish at the task in hand. And I've no idea what the voters are going to do in March or May or whenever it comes, but should they decide to put David Cameron into Downing Street, I hope very much that we won't hear any more of this nonsense about you being too clever and too ambitious to stick with the culture brief. Clever, ambitious is good. We can't have enough of either of them. But committed and informed and serious about this job is even better, and you have displayed all the above. So I warn you, if you pop up running the war in Afghanistan, there's going to be trouble, and not just in Helmand. Jeremy will start with an important speech, and Matthew Taylor will then respond. I will try to chisel enough time for everyone to participate in this discussion. So Jeremy, would you like to start us off, please? Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming today, braving the weather. Thank you, Matthew and Alan, for organising this conference. I think it's a great idea. I think it'd be really good to do this outside London in another year, and I think it's a really good idea just to step back, and sometimes moving outside London helps you to do that once a year and really think about the future strategic direction you want to go over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, not just over short-term horizon. So I think this is a really, really good idea for a conference. I was thinking about the arts and the state of the arts when Richard Wright won the Turner Prize, and he gave that wonderfully humble acceptance speech. And as you will all know, the thing about his art is that it's meant to be temporary. And I think, in fact, the painting that won the Turner Prize is due to be destroyed at the end of this month, which seems a terrible tragedy. And actually, listening to him on front row, I did sense there was room for negotiation on that one. But what he said was that the reason that he makes his art temporary is because he's interested in the fragility of the moment of engagement. And in some ways, I think that's quite a good metaphor for the state of arts in general. The fragility, but also the utter brilliance of the arts that we have in this country is something that I think that anyone who has the responsibility of shepherding the arts through the period that we are now going through needs to reflect on. And if you go down a floor at Tate Britain from where Richard Wright's masterpiece is being displayed, they've got the Turner and the Masters exhibition, which I really recommend seeing if you haven't seen it, because it is a brilliant exposition on the nature of genius. But there too you can reflect on something else that's amazing about the British art scene, which is the way we've built on an extraordinary heritage, but also have an incredibly vibrant and exciting and challenging present as well. Now, I think that when it comes to politicians and the art, politics and art never really mix, and if they do, it's usually art that wins. There's a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, Liz may know, but there's a story that a civil servant once said to Tessa Jowell, Minister, the arts only want two things from the government: money and silence. And I sort of have that engraved in my mind whenever I'm asked to hold forth on arts. But I just want to get the politics out of the way, if I could, at the beginning. And I think there is a lazy assumption that when it comes to the arts, Labour is good, Tory is bad. And I think that it's important to have a balanced picture. I wouldn't say that everything that happened under the last Conservative government was good by any means at all for the arts. But there were two very important things that did happen. One was the creation of the Department for National Heritage, which then became the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and put arts on the top table for the first time around the cabinet. And the second was the founding of the National Lottery, which has generated £4 billion for the arts since it was launched in 1994 and completely transformed the funding environment for the arts. Nor is it the case that everything Labour has done has been bad. I actually think that Chris Smith was a very good culture secretary. He tells me that every time I say that, it ruins his credibility in the Labour Party. You know, he did some very important things. I think he did something that very few ministers achieve, which is that he actually left a mark. You can point to some things that Chris Smith did that are still having impact now, like free museums, which, you know, are here to stay under the Conservatives if we win, but also like his very important work in identifying the role of the creative industries, which is something I want to talk about and is becoming more and more important. That was work that he started over 10 years ago, and I think that's been very important. But there have been some minuses as well, and I think the worst thing that's happened has been the raiding of lottery funds. Over £1.5 billion has been taken out of lottery funds that would have gone to the arts, and that was initially for political projects and then for the Olympics. But the result is that funding from the lottery has halved since 1997, and as a result of that, it's actually something that not many people know, but if you combine lottery funding and exchequer funding for the arts, it's actually less now than it was when Labour came to power in 1997. And I think that was a big mistake. I think we've also had a lot of turnover. And we've had 4 culture secretaries in as many years. I've been Shadow Culture Secretary for 2.5 years. Ed Vaizey's been my Shadow Arts Minister over that period. And we hope very much that if we do win the next election, we are in this role and in this role for a considerable period of time, because I think you do need stability of leadership. And the other thing I think we have to recognise is that it's not true to say that there are no cuts under Labour. The cuts have already started. The Arts Council has had a cash cut. The museums have had their budget cut by 0.5%. The Film Council's lost 25 million. The universities have just lost 600 million, which I'm sure will have some knock-on effect. And I think rather than a puerile debate saying, you know, whether the arts are safe under this party or safe under that party, I think we need to move to an intelligent and sensible debate about how we help the arts weather the biggest economic crisis that we've had since the Second World War. That's the real issue. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, because I've got 4 policy proposals that I think will really help in this climate. However, there's one other argument that I think all of us need to work together to confront, which is this argument that in a time of recession, something that Alan alluded to, in a time of recession, what matters is getting the economy on its feet, sorting out the deficit, and the arts don't really have a role. I think that is fundamentally wrong. It's wrong for social reasons and for economic reasons. For social reasons because, as I think one of the Guardian columnists said about 6 months ago, it is actually in recessions that people need art the most, because it's in recessions that people want things that can either explain their problems or help them escape from their problems. And the arts manage to do both magnificently well. But also, let's not forget the economic impact of the arts. They are the powerhouse behind Britain's creative industries. Yesterday I came back from a trip to Singapore, and I was there looking at Singapore's digital backbone, which is one of the most advanced in the world. And I said to the chairman of the Singaporean equivalent of Ofcom, I said, if you were going to describe Britain in one word, what's the word you would use? And he said, creative. And Singapore, which is a country which is, you know, technologically more progressive than anywhere else in the world, is looking at Britain and saying, how can we learn from your creativity, the incredible vibrance of your creative industries, the largest independent television production sector in the world, the second largest exporter of TV formats, second largest music exporter, third largest market for film industry or video games. And, you know, taken together, those creative industries are worth about 7% of our GDP. They employ 2 million people. And it is the arts, the vibrancy of our arts, that power them. whether it's our actors who start off at the National and go on to star in the West End or in Hollywood, whether it's Danny Boyle starting off at the Royal Court and then going on to win 8 Oscars for Britain with Slumdog Millionaire. It's that creativity at the start, that link between the funded arts sector and the commercially viable creative industries that is an incredibly important part of the equation. And that is why a new Conservative government is totally committed to a mixed economy for the arts. We recognise that we do very well in this country because we have the best of European state support, but we also have private giving, although not on the scale that they have in America, it still does happen, and so we are absolutely committed to that. But let me just talk about funding, because I think this is the thing that's on a lot of people's minds, at least it's on a lot of people's minds when they talk to me. And I think there are 4 things that we can do. The first is return the National Lottery to its original 4 pillars so that arts gets its share of funding, the share of funding that it originally got when the lottery was founded, namely 20%, which is considerably more than it gets now. It's getting £240 million a year less than in 1997. And we have said that we will raise the arts share progressively to 20%, which could mean £50 million more annually for the arts. It could mean a lot more depending on how lottery sales go and post the Olympics, but I think there's a huge opportunity there. Secondly, we want to do something, and I'm afraid this may make Alan and Liz a little bit uncomfortable, but we think admin costs are way too high in arts administration in this country. I mean, the Heritage Lottery Fund admin costs increased from 6% to 13% of the amount they distribute between 2002 and 2008. Alan may dispute this, but the latest figures I've seen of the Arts Council are around 11% of the money it distributes gets used up in admin. If you take our 7 main funds distributors together, they're using up £120 million annually in admin, and I just think that's too high when everyone else is having to tighten their belts. And so we have said that all grant distributors need to control their admin costs to be no more than 5% of the total amount they distribute, and that will release more money to go to arts organisations. Thirdly, I want to do what we can to lay the foundations for an American philanthropy culture in this country. I think we've got a few seeds sprouting here and there, but we could do a lot more. As soon as we can afford to, we will introduce lifetime giving by extending the acceptance in lieu scheme. I want to get rid of the regulations that prevent arts organisations rewarding benefactors, simplify the gift aid rules. And finally, just as I think we could have a better culture of giving in this country, I would like us to have a better culture of asking. And in particular, I would like to see our major arts organisations building up proper endowments. Now, the American museum sector has endowments worth about £14 billion, which is a tremendously useful other pillar of income. The reason that we haven't built up endowments in this country is because most large cultural organisations are worried that if they build up an endowment, their treasury grant will be cut. And so we are prepared to offer large arts and cultural organisations 5-year funding agreements, stability in funding for 5 years, in return for commitment to build up an endowment to agreed levels. And that way I think we can start to improve and develop a real philanthropic culture. Let me just finish with a couple of things. I think excellence has to run through everything we do. It's absolutely fundamental. I think we moved on from this debate about intrinsic value of art versus the instrumentalist value of art. I think we want both. When you look at the power of music therapy in teaching disabled children, I mean, you know, there is an incredibly important social function for the arts. But excellence has to run through everything we do, whether it's a new play by Lucy Prebble or a new film by Mike Leigh. Excellence is at the cornerstone of what makes our art successful. And for that reason, we are absolutely committed to getting rid of many of the targets that arts organisations have, strengthening their independence by getting rid of Treasury year-end funding rules for NDPBs, and respecting and strengthening the arm's length principle. I don't want ministers to be making decisions about which arts organisations get funding. There will be an Arts Council under a future Conservative government. Hopefully it'll be leaner but not meaner. And I want it, though, to continue to be a guardian for the arts and avoid the politicisation of funding decisions. But I also hope that if the government steps back and says we're going to have fewer targets, you as arts organisations will continue to really focus on broadening engagement. Because if you believe in arts, you believe, and I know everyone here is passionate about the arts, then you think that that should be available to everyone. But there are just too many children in this country who don't have the exposure to arts at school that all of us had. And I think that's something that we really need to think about. But I think the new way to improve engagement is not by targets, saying you've got to get so many of this group of people and so many of that group of people coming to your events. It's actually by technology. And I would point out a really good example of that is Tony Hall's experiment at the Royal Opera House, which is broadcasting opera to nearly 80 digital cinemas worldwide. We've had an opera broadcast digitally in my own constituency in Farnham, Gavin Strive from the Malting sitting in the second row. But I think that's what we need to think about when we're talking about engagement. So I just want to say this, going to Liz's comments. I too don't know the result of the next election, but if the Conservatives win and if I end up as Culture Secretary, as I very much hope to, it will be an incredible honour for me to work with all of you. And I want people to say that on my watch, the arts not just weathered a very, very difficult period, but also laid the foundations for a new golden age for the arts. And with imagination, commitment, and determination, I'm convinced that we can make that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the speech, Jeremy. It was great. Although you did say one thing that I found incredibly worrying, and that's this, that you've told that Tessa Jowell story before, because of course I read all your speeches, and the last time you told that story, you said that the civil servant said to Tessa that all the arts sector wants from government is policy, money and silence, and now the policy is gone. Now, I don't know what we should read from the fact that you've concluded that the sector doesn't want policy, but I can assure you the sector does still want policy. The second thing I wanted to say was I'm not going to add to the glowing tributes that Liz paid you and the team, the continuity of the team and the strength of the argument you've made, but I think the other thing that you should be commended for is that you managed to persuade, whether you were involved in persuading, whether you did it spontaneously, George Osborne to make a major speech on the arts in November at the Tate. And I think that is a very, very important signal that you have your colleagues, and particularly the person who's going to be in charge of the purse strings, making a speech, a very positive speech about the arts. I really just wanted to then to make three one-line comments, and none of them contradict anything that you said in your speech, but they reinforce it, I guess. Clearly this money issue is going to be important, and you have some interesting policies about how it is that we can redirect money into the sector, how we can bring new money into the sector. But as you'll know, none of these things are as easy as we might imagine. Some of the streams of national lottery funding that you're talking about redirecting, some of those streams do fund arts activities as well as other things. If you go to the Treasury and you ask them to improve the context for philanthropy, they will immediately tell you that it's going to cost billions and billions of pounds and have deadweight costs and all those kinds of things. So the money issue won't go away. I am also delighted to hear the point that you made right at the beginning of your speech about the importance for the sector. Having worked in Number 10, unfortunately, it just happens that there is a sense that DCMS is somehow a kind of fluffy department on the margins, and it's absolutely central to the mission that you've described that changes. It's terrible, and maybe it's apocryphal, but the story is told that when the first capability reviews were being done in Whitehall, senior civil servants in each department were asked to, as an exercise, to say what shape and what colour their department was. And the DCMS came out as a primrose amoeba. I'm sure that story is untrue, but what that story tells you
Stop
is that
telling it, Matthew.
is that people like to think it is true. That's the point about the story, and it's going to be absolutely vital that people really get the message of the importance of this sector to the economy and to the Conservative vision of a strong society, and so that your voice and the voice of your department is heard in those debates about economic strategy and about social cohesion, not simply in the kind of time reserved for conversation about arts and culture and sport. And the final point I want to make was this. I think a very interesting theme in Conservative policy across the piece, which you have reinforced, is this idea of wanting to trust the provider. You heard it in the education, you hear Michael Gove talking about it in relation to education, and Julie Lansley talking about it in relation to health. And it's also a message that you're giving to this sector, that you want to be a government that is not beset by targets, a sector that's beset by targets. You want to minimise bureaucracy, you want to get the money to the front line and trust the sector to do what's best. And I think one of the interesting debates for us to have today is what demands does that place on the sector? Because I absolutely accept that you say this with intent and with real goodwill, but as you know, when you're in government and the media discover bits of bad practice and they claim that money is being wasted or there's self-indulgence, you will find yourself and your colleagues will find themselves on the radio and TV being confronted, particularly when tough decisions are being made in hospitals and schools and police forces with questions about why on earth money is being spent in this way. And then to hold the line and to say, no, actually, we're not a government that's going to centralise at the first whiff of trouble. We're going to stick to our guns. That is what's hard. And I think one of the challenges for us to discuss today is how it is if you are elected and if you give that trust challenge to the sector, how the sector rises to that challenge.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
I'm Alistair Spalding. I'm the Artistic Director of Sadler's Wells, also on the Arts Council of England. And I just want to ask Jeremy if he's observed what's actually happening in across the Atlantic at the moment in the States, because there's been a heavy reliance on A, philanthropy, and B, endowments. I don't know the exact figures, but from what I read in the arts press, there's about 3 or 4 arts organisations closing each week there, because basically both philanthropy and endowment have fallen through the floor in this economic crisis. So my question is whether he thinks that actually we have a better model here, where there is a kind of a stability provided by the Arts Council money to arts organisations, which we shouldn't lose, and this move towards philanthropy and endowment should be taken with a bit of care. I'd just like his comments on that.
I agree with you. I think we do have a better model. I think that that stability of government funding is incredibly important, and I think also often different types of funding support different types of art. I mean, a philanthropist might support a very talented 7-year-old violinist right the way through his or her career with huge support in a way that might be difficult. It's not impossible, but might be difficult for a government agency. And so my argument is not that philanthropy should replace central government funding or lottery funding at all. My argument is that it should be an additional pillar, because I think for your funding, the way to be safest from all the different squalls that inevitably happen is to have a variety of funding sources. And philanthropy, overdependence on philanthropy is as dangerous as overdependence on state funding, as we've seen from the States. I think we need to have them all.
Goodness me, doesn't he give good answers? Would you please all put your hands up so we can plan ahead? There's somebody there. Go ahead. Yeah,
hello.
The microphone go.
My name's John Spooner. I'm the Artistic Director of Unlimited Theatre, which is a small organisation based in Leeds. And I have 2 observations, the second of which I hope Jeremy will be able to come back on. The first one being that no actor starts at the National Theatre. Many would consider that to be the pinnacle of their career should they get the opportunity to work there. And actually the bedrock of the creative industries, the performing arts, the arts in this country, work at a much smaller level and work in the regions and outside of London, as you said. And I think I'd really hope that you would take that on board. Secondly, in the things that you said you would do, and I think this has been partly addressed in what you just said, but you absolutely didn't say that you would sustain government funding contributions from the government in the future, and I know that I would certainly like to hear that you are committed absolutely to maintaining a level of funding that exists at the moment, at the very least, if not increasing it. Thank you.
Well, I absolutely stand corrected and will delete it from my script to ever say that anyone started at the National Theatre. Absolutely fair point. I can't promise to maintain funding. I would love to be able to promise to maintain funding, but I think the reality is that we face cuts, whoever wins the next election. And I think what I can promise you is that we are committed to the mixed funding model. We believe in the importance of state funding, as I mentioned in my response to the earlier question. And I can promise you that the arts won't be singled out because we recognise their fundamental strategic importance to the economy as well as to society. But can I say that the arts won't have to bear their share of the pain? I can't say that, because the reality is that actually getting the economy back on its feet, which I happen to believe does mean sorting out the deficit, is something that is as important for the arts as for everyone else, because in the end, if the economic motor that's driving the country is bust, that will affect the arts, however much we might wish it didn't. And so my priority is to try and find as many ways as possible to make sure that if there are cuts in public support for the arts, they have as little effect as possible, which is why I've been spending a lot of time with Ed Vasey, my excellent Shadow Arts Minister, trying to work out other policies that can help to sustain arts provision during a very difficult period.
Right, has anyone got the microphone? If not, there are hands all over the place. Who's got the nearest? After that, there's two people down here. So first over there, and then over here.
Thank you. John Tuser, Chairman of the University of the Arts London. Jeremy, I think most of the things you say, or a lot of things you say about what central government will do, or hope to do, are welcome and sensible. The impression I get is that one of the main areas of problem about funding lies in the local authorities, and that whatever the central government does, the prospect of real cuts, because local authorities say they cannot afford to maintain arts funding, that represents at least as great, if not a greater, challenge and a problem to the future of the arts. And I wonder, is there anything that the DCMS might be able to do to make sure that however much funding is protected at the centre, it is not then disproportionately cut by local authorities?
John, that is a really important question. John wrote a very helpful arts task force report for the Conservative Party a couple of years ago, which has helped to shape our thinking, and thank you for that. But you're absolutely right. I think actually if you aggregate the support by local authorities throughout the country, it actually works out as more than the Arts Council's support in total, and it's an incredibly important source of funding. It's under real pressure. And I think one of the things actually I could have mentioned about Chris Smith in my paean of praise to him, but didn't, is that I think one of the other positive things that's happened recently is that local authorities who are in charge of regeneration or redevelopment strategies have realised that having a cultural strategy is an incredibly important part of making a redevelopment or a regeneration project work, because it sort of creates an X factor that stops a redevelopment being dull or boring or soulless. And they've twigged that actually commercially, if you want people to take space, then you need to have rent space in new developments, then you need to have that. So I think we need to bang the drum for the economic importance of the arts in local regeneration strategies. And I think we also need to, I think I have a job to do, because I think it's a curate's egg, and you know, whether Conservative councils or Labour councils, you find some that get the arts and some that don't. And with Conservative councils, I obviously have a special responsibility to bang the drum for how arts really can make a difference, and Ed Vasey and I certainly try to do that.
Right, over here.
Maurice Davis, Museums Association. I'd quite like to explore the point Matthew mentioned about attitudes to culture, and this is an open question really to all three of you. Is the problem that the kind of treasury and political classes don't take culture seriously, or is it more that they don't take DCMS seriously? Because I think that's a critical point. And actually, the discussion about local authorities may have hints of the answer to that in it. But I'm just very interested. Do we face a fundamental problem of English Philistinism, say, that really we're never taken seriously because it's not the thing to do if you're a serious politician or a serious financial person? Or is it more about DCMS's status within government, which in a way is a lesser issue for us to deal with?
Do you want to answer?
I think there are a combination of factors. I think that there are questions about whether the kind of bundling of functions in DCMS works in that way. I think it's, as I said at the beginning, one of the reasons that we organised this conference was to try to get this sector to have as much kind of self-confidence and be as kind of pushy as the broadcasting sector can be. And I find it interesting that the Secretaries of State in that department seem to spend so much time and put so much energy into kind of the whole area of public service broadcasting, regulation of broadcasting, which is a part of what they do. And they seem to put so much more into that than they do into the arts sector as well. Maybe Mark Twain once said, you know, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that the tendency is in government that those things which you feel you can directly affect are the things that you focus on. And the fact is, an awful lot of what goes on in this sector has nothing to do with government. And so I think that is part of it as well. But I do sense a change. And I think certainly the message about the importance of creativity to the economy is finally really hitting home. And that, you know, to be fair, people like Tessa Jowell and Chris Smith have been arguing that for a long time, and people kind of thought, yeah, well, you were bound to say that, aren't you? You know, because in a sense, every department likes to kind of say that it's not just about giving money out, but it's also about the strength of the economy and society. But, you know, having hammered it and hammered it and hammered it, I think there is a recognition, and I think that is particularly been brought to bear because when the economy as a whole has been doing very badly over the last couple of years, the creative sector, or certain parts of the creative sector, have done very well and have held up. And I think that has had an impact on those parts of the Treasury and other parts of the kind of Whitehall which might not have listened to that argument seriously before. So I think that is changing.
I want to steal a moment from the coffee break just to have a couple more questions. There's one there, and is there somebody else over this side? No, okay, Sandy or
Sandy Nairn, Director of the National Portrait Gallery. 2 points really about process. Jeremy, I welcome what you say, but you say you don't want targets, and yet this idea of a target on the bodies, whether in the heritage or the arts sector, slightly worries me, because it worries me that it potentially gives the idea that the heritage bodies and the arts bodies are simply distributing funds. I mean, we're all for leaner, tighter, more effective bodies. But actually, the heritage and the arts bodies have a real role in developing policy and strategy in arts and heritage development, in connectivity, in community, work with local authorities. I mean, it's a huge role. Setting a target of 5% seems to me to have rather displaced the idea of these bodies having a real part of the future. And I just think there's a real question there about process. And just on endowments, I mean, I welcome the thought about really working on endowments. There's some work this government's been doing on higher education about trying to encourage and testing really on whether tax breaks will make a difference for higher education institutes and universities, and I think we're all watching that with great interest. But it is a big cultural change on one hand. I mean, I think we're talking 20, 30 years, and I don't think we should underestimate the timescale. It's also about governance. I mean, looking at the American museums, Alistair points out the dangers and the fragilities in this, but it's also about governance. I mean, for many American museums, joining the board is a way of buying your place. And we have systems of governance that we've evolved, I think, very carefully, in which we need to just be very aware that simply going for endowments and thinking that that will just work and allowing those riches to come in that way, we've just got to be very careful about that process.
I think we do. I mean, you know, I'm not a believer that we want to just take wholesale the system that another country has and bring it to the UK. And I completely agree with you that there are things that happen there that we wouldn't want to happen here. But I do think there's a real opportunity. People used to say that the reason that we don't have philanthropy to American levels in this country is because we don't have as much money as America. But actually, when the City of London gets back on its feet anyway, that simply won't be the case. And there is a huge amount of money flowing around in London, and in America it is absolutely normal for people who've made large sums of money to use it to support a cultural or charitable organisation. And I think it would be a very good thing for society if we had that cultural norm here. And that's what, and this is not just about supporting the arts, incidentally, it's a much broader agenda. It's about supporting the universities, supporting charities. I think it's something that is a real opportunity for us to develop. And I want to do it in as light touch way as possible, which is why I think that, you know, it's an offer, and you may not want to take it for the National Portrait Gallery. The offer is, if you want a 5-year funding settlement and that stability, then you come to me with a plan and show me how you're going to build up your endowments over that period. And you don't have to take up that offer, but it's just for those people who are interested in building up that alternative source of funding. Then that door is open. With respect to policy, I think that relates to what Matthew was saying. And one of the reasons I think DCMS has not had the respect it should within Whitehall is because it has often subcontracted policy to its constituent bodies, whether it's Ofcom for media regulation or the Arts Council for arts policy. And I think that policy should be decided by ministers. I think that's what we're elected to do. And I think that the truth is, if you are a brilliant person who wants to work at the centre of arts policy, you're probably more likely to want to work for the Arts Council than to want to work for DCMS. And I think that's wrong. And I think we do need good people thinking about policy at DCMS. And I think that will help to raise the credibility of DCMS within government. And finally, you talked about 5% as an arbitrary target. I think it is a bit arbitrary, although actually you can find lots of other organisations that do manage to keep their admin costs to below 5%, including, I'm sure, lots of organisations represented in this room today. I think one of the problems is that if you are a grant distributing organisation and your job is to give out grants, but actually there is no structural constraint on how much you spend on your own admin, your own salaries, your own buildings, then there is always going to be a temptation to spend more at the centre and not to run the centre as efficiently as you possibly can so that you can distribute money out to the people that you're there to distribute money to. Now, if you can think of a better way of creating that focus on being as lean and mean as possible in order to get the maximum amount of money distributed out to arts organisations, then I'm very happy to listen. But you know, so far the only way I can think of is an admittedly rather arbitrary target, but a way just to focus people on bringing their admin costs under control.
Jeremy, can I ask a question? On the subject of private philanthropy, what would you say was the statistical likelihood of the Treasury agreeing to lifetime giving tax breaks? Because it is absolutely the key to the whole question, isn't it?
That's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm going to have to duck that.
Fine.
Because
okay.
Just because you know, we've got acceptance in principle from our shadow Treasury team that this is something to do, but I really don't know what's going to happen when Treasury civil servants get their teeth into these proposals. But you know, George Osborne is committed to it, and I'm committed to it, so I think it's a good start.
Thanks. One more question. There we are. Okay.
John Hope Hawkins. I'm the chairman of the SAA, Society for All Artists, which is a self-funding, self-profit-making organisation. And I speak for about 100,000 people who paint. Mrs. Smith at 3 Acacia Avenue is probably my typical member. I think you need empowerment and engagement, but the volunteer sector is a vitally important one to that. And if funds are short, then one of the things we can do is to empower people to encourage and help other people to paint. I spend a lot of my time in care homes and hospices and encouraging volunteers to go in and help. And one of the things we need is less regulation. We need more control over CRB checks and all that sort of nonsense, because it really does disincentivize people to get out there and help other people to do it. And lots and lots of people would love to do it. And I think also the whole thing of art and health, which I know is a strand that's been an enormous amount talked about, we've done a lot of research into with people like Dr. Theo Stickley at Nottingham University, and there's a massive amount of work that's been done on art and health. And when the Secretary of State, Alan Johnson, said, when he was Secretary of State for Health, said that it actually reduces time in hospital, can reduce drugs that people are engaged practically in art and cultural events, not more in the doing rather than the viewing, the taking part and having success at something that they've achieved, they've done it. By gosh, it makes them feel a lot better. That will lift the country and will save an enormous amount of cash, I believe.
I agree. One of the things I think we've got wrong in this country is our attitude to education, because we have this system in this country where you sort of do full-time education until you're 18 or 20, then you stop doing any education at all until you retire, and then you might go to evening classes or community groups or whatever. And I think we need to think about education as something that happens throughout our lives, because I think it's one of the great joys and privileges to learn to do something new for the first time. And I think, as you said, the arts have an incredible role in doing that. So I would want to support you in any way I could.
I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to end this session now. I know there are many more questions, but I would like to thank Matthew and Jeremy very much indeed for starting us off so marvellously. I think, Jeremy, that listening to you talk, I think you have done all you could do at this stage in your job. And I think what you have said to us is, what you have given us is a challenge, and that is to give you a good hand to play. It is a great pleasure that we don't have to start the argument by persuading the potential Secretary of State. I think that is a great step forward, for which I'm grateful. But thank you both very much indeed. Please come back at 10:50.